These are complex people. I don't want to cancel these people. I just find that this is stupidity. That was the time that they lived in. You drive around in a car, okay? You're spewing fossil fuel. Someday there's going to be clean energy. 300 years from now, they're going to put a shroud over your statue, okay? They're going to be like, who were these guys, okay? What the hell were they doing ruining the earth like that?
I totally agree. My view is it's not a historian's job to say these are the heroes, these are the bad guys. My job is to put you in the canoe, show you what Jefferson cared about, show you what Lewis cared about, then you make up your mind.
Welcome to Open Book. I am your host, Anthony Scaramucci. Joining us today is Craig Fairman. He is a journalist and a historian and is out with a new incredible book, The Vast Enterprise, A New History of Lewis and Clark. It's hard to imagine, okay? I thought everything that could have been written was written about Lewis and Clark, but you have uncovered so much more new information. But before we get into the book, I'd like our viewers and listeners to know a little bit about you, Craig. Tell us about your background. Welcome to the show, and congratulations on this awesome book.
Sure. Well, thanks for saying all that, and thanks for having me. I'm talking to you guys from Indiana today. That's where I live. That's where I grew up. And so I went to grad school at Yale, and I actually went to be an English professor because I just love books and I love stories. But while I was in grad school, I found a few small archival things, and I was like, this is really fun. Like that, it's kind of almost like a detective story. You get that charge, that thrill of finding new things. And so what I love about my job now is I can kind of combine both. I can tell big stories and I can try to find new things. And this book on Lewis and Clark was the best synthesis I've ever had in my career. It's probably our best American epic. It's such a great story, but I was also able to find so many new things and bring those together in hopefully an engaging way.
This is the quintessential mid-century American story. Okay, so tell us why I'm saying that. Early century, I should say early 19th century American story. Tell our viewers and listeners why I'm saying that.
Sure. I really think, and this ties into sort of being in the middle of America's 250th birthday too, that this is just one of the best stories, maybe the best story to understand America at the start. Because what you have to remember is Lewis and Clark leave in 1804. That's a while after the Revolution and the Declaration and all that stuff. But America wasn't finished yet. The White House wasn't finished. There were chunks of plaster falling out of the ceiling. The country wasn't finished either. So America was 30 years later just starting to figure out what it could be. So I think of Lewis and Clark as our first act of foreign policy. I think of Lewis and Clark as our first big kind of research project, our first sort of proto-NASA attempt to understand the world around us. Lewis and Clark was a chance for Americans to do what Americans do best, and also in a few cases to do what we don't always do best, but that's why it's a good story. It's got everything you would want in terms of humanity, morality, excitement, action.
And, listen, you did 5 years of research on this, okay? So tell us why you have this passion about Lewis and Clark.
Well, when I started looking for my new book, I knew I wanted to tell an action story, and Lewis and Clark was probably where my mind went first. I mean, when you think of American epics, that's where you go. But I didn't want to write a book that just recapitulated what other books had said, because there's been a lot of great writing about the expedition. So I went to the journals. The journals are probably the best thing about Lewis and Clark. They're more than 1 million words recorded in real time from different perspectives on what they saw and what they did. And as I read the journals, I realized I only know half of the story. Let me give you a quick example. When I was reading early in the journals, before they even left St. Louis, there's just this one little line from Clark where he says, York commenced sawing with a whipsaw. York was the black man that Clark enslaved, and he was on the whole expedition too. And I just thought, like, well, what does that line mean? What's a whipsaw do? Well, it makes planks. It's a really complicated tool to use correctly. Planks put roofs on huts. They build beds. They really needed these planks. Well, why did they pick York? There were dozens of white soldiers around there. It's because York was skilled. So York was so skilled. How did that affect his relationship to Clark? How did he fit in the unit? From this one little detail in the journals that's always been there for people to kind of pluck out, I was able to understand so much about York's story, York's contributions. And so once I started seeing these kind of human moments and realized that there was a lot more story to tell, in addition to talking about, Lewis and Clark too, I was like, okay, this is worth spending 5 years of my life on, because I got to get this story right. This story matters to so many Americans. So I felt an obligation to tell it, the whole story.
Vast enterprise. It comes from Jefferson's phrase.
It's a Clark letter to Jefferson.
A Clark letter to Jefferson. So tell us about what he meant, and tell us why you made that the title of the book.
Sure. Well, I think a lot of us, when we picture Lewis and Clark, we just picture Lewis and Clark, right? Like that's even the signs you see all over the American West, the highway signs. They're like those brown signs with a white silhouette, and it's just two guys on it. But to me, the expedition was always about way more than just the two guys at the top. And what's important is that Lewis and Clark saw this too. This isn't me imposing some kind of modern view on this. When Clark wrote to Jefferson, he was like, I'm happy to join, quote, this vast enterprise. Clark knew it was going to be big, not just in terms of geography, they were going to cross a continent. He knew it was going to take a lot of people and a lot of hard work. And so my book tried to capture everybody, not just Lewis and Clark, but the working class soldiers who are standing in the freezing river trying to tow the canoes, the native people who kind of have their own agendas and their own priorities. I tried to bring everybody in. This is an ensemble, and those are my favorite kinds of stories. Not just a star at the top, but a story where lots of human beings are kind of clashing and conflicting and coming together.
Uh, Jefferson funds this, right?
Oh yeah, that's one of the things that's new in my book is that the expedition was just so expensive. If you sort of adjust for percentages, America's federal government spent as much on Lewis and Clark as we spend on NASA today. So it was a huge expense on government resources, and it was hard for Jefferson to get it funded. You know, this doesn't really need much explanation because of the world we live in now. But Washington in 1804 was a very partisan place. There were two sides, they hated each other, and pretty much any idea from one side was going to be opposed by the other side. So even though Lewis and Clark seems all American, seems like something everybody would want, Jefferson's political opponents despised this idea and did everything they could to stop him. The fact that Jefferson was able to work this through Congress, it's sort of like the power broker. It was kind of like a Robert Cairo story, but set in 1804. And my book's the first one to tell that story.
If you could go back in time and you could interview Lewis, Clark, or Jefferson, what would be some of the things you would want to talk to them about? What are some of the things you would say, "Hey, wow, this was amazing. I'm coming to you from 200 and, 50 years later, under 50 years later. This is amazing."
Yeah, that would be such an amazing opportunity. I think with Jefferson, I would probably try to pin him a little down a little bit more about what exactly he wanted the expedition to do and in what time frame. Because Jefferson is such a great writer that he almost seems to shift letter to letter. His writing is so evocative, but it's not always precise. And you can see this in his relationship to race and all kinds of other things too. But I would sort of try to understand more, what precisely he wanted the expedition to do. Because my reading, based on reconstructing it from these letters, is that he kind of wanted the expedition to do everything. We think about how hard it was for Lewis and Clark to go 8,000 miles and deal with rapids and mountains and all that. But Jefferson's sort of research checklist for them was just overwhelming. And it's just, it's amazing how many things he wanted them to do. So I would ask Jefferson a little bit more pointedly, like what exactly were you imagining? And then I guess I would ask Lewis and Clark, you know, I would ask them about their relationship with their soldiers, especially because one thing I thought was really interesting that I found with sort of hints was that Lewis and Clark picked a different way to be military leaders. This was very much a military mission. But in this time period, most officers would just kind of beat their men and ask questions later. It was a very violent time. Lewis and Clark chose to do things in a more democratic and kind of progressive way, not in terms of political terms or anything like that, but just in terms of, they let the men vote on things. They let the men participate. And I thought that was such an interesting choice in terms of leadership. And I would love to ask them, what was your idea there? Was that just sort of necessity or did you guys have a theory? Whatever the reasons, it worked out.
So you found Clark's college notebook.
That's
Turns
right.
out turns out he was a bad speller, right? He didn't really, he didn't have that going on for him. But
Mhm.
how did that change your view of him?
Well, it's I'm glad you bring this up because it's a really key detail. Nobody else even knows that Clark went to college. Like if you read the other books, there's just a joke about his spelling and they kind of move on. Lewis is the brainy one, right? And Lewis definitely was brainy. There's no question that he was kind of the scientist on the mission. But Clark was an Enlightenment thinker too. And so I found Clark's college notebook and I found a biography written by somebody way back in the 19th century who was a family friend. And this person talked about Clark going to college. And so when you're a historian, you find these documents and it's exciting, but you have several steps where you want to vet it. So I went to some professors in colleges and sort of shared what I'd found with them. And it's so cool. They know this stuff so well. Then when I was like, this is the astronomy textbook that Clark was reading. They said, okay, well, that means he probably went to William and Mary. That's how well they know this time period, which is great. But they didn't know that Clark went to college. And so if we understand that, yeah, he was a bad speller, I'm going to cut him some slack here. He didn't have spell check. He didn't have air conditioning. He's doing the best he can. But even though his spelling was bad, his ideas were really complicated. And so like Jefferson, He thought that the expedition was an attempt to sort of change a region, remake a region, sort of be America's first attempt at regime change and sort of cultivating this vast stretch of country that was full of people, but people who, from the American point of view, could change and develop. And those are ideas Clark learned in college.
Thank you for tuning into Open Book. And if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button below so that you're the first to know when our new episodes drop each week. We got a lot more coming. And now back to the show. Okay, so again, fascinating about this book are some of the forgotten figures. So I want to talk about John Ordway for a second,
Sure.
and his impact on this exploration.
Yeah. Well, when I wrote this book, if anybody has read Game of Thrones, that might be the best analogy here. Each chapter rotates to a different point of view. So, chapter 1 starts with Lewis. Chapter 3 is Jefferson. We get the main people too, but also some of the chapters rotate to people that you might not have heard of or might not have thought of. And John Ordway is one of them. It's really important to include him because he was a working class guy from New Hampshire, and his experience of the expedition was totally different than the captains. The captains were both wealthy elites. Like we said, Clark went to college. So these are people from the 1% of American society. John Ordway was not. So his experience, first of all, shows how hard the regular men had to work. The detail that always sticks with me is when they were towing their canoes against the current in the Missouri, they would lean forward to grab bushes just to get leverage. One time, one of the soldiers leaned forward, grabbed a bush and pulled, and instead he pulled out a rattlesnake in his hand. Somehow he didn't get bit. It's just an unbelievable detail. So that was the life of the soldiers, but Ordway also cared so much about land. He was poor, which is why he was a soldier, and so he's on the Missouri seeing all this beautiful land around him, and you can sort of understand what potential for a farm might mean to a working class person in this time.
So there's an enslaved man that you're writing about in this book by the name of York. You've helped to raise the attention actually of this person. So tell us who York was. Am I saying this right? I would call him a slave
Yeah.
of Clark's, right?
No, that's exactly right. Clark freed him, but more than a decade after the expedition. So York spent the vast majority of his life enslaved by the Clark family. York was about the same age as Clark, and so they grew up together. But there are so many examples from enslaved people in this period talking about this that once you turn 8, 9, 10, the kids start getting treated like adults when they're enslaved. And so they have to go do the hard work, and they start to realize, well, my life isn't like this other person's life at all. And so York was there every step of the way. And it was a difficult and complicated relationship for him. Clark was a difficult owner. Clark beat his slaves. Clark participated fully in the institution of American slavery. But it was really important for me in telling this story to not just talk about Clark as somebody who was enslaved, but to talk about him as an explorer. I found these new documents that make it really clear that York was one of the best people in a canoe on the entire expedition. He was a great swimmer, which might not seem like much today, but in the 19th century, a lot of people did not know how to swim, which it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around it today. You're on the Lewis and Clark expedition and you can't swim. Why are you even here? But that happened a lot. So when they hit the worst rapids, they needed their best swimmers and their best paddlers to get the boats through. And York was one of those people. So in multiple ways, we can see, there are just little mentions of him like that whipsaw or like these new letters I found. But we can see that York wasn't just somebody who was there to take care of Clark. He was there to explore, and he ended up becoming one of the most important members of the entire expedition.
I read Ambrose's book, Daunted Courage. It's got to be about almost 30 years ago. And I thought, okay, this is a fascinating story, but again, I read it 30 years ago. Forgive me, but my impression after reading your book is there was some hagiography in his book, and there was some simplicity to his book. It was more about the adventure and less about the complexity of the personalities. I didn't remember in the book, for example, how volatile Lewis was.
Mhm.
And so I want you to compare and contrast your book, because I'm sure you've read on Undaunted
Mhm.
Courage.
Sure.
And then let's talk a little bit about Lewis, whose death almost certainly was from suicide. That more or less,
Yeah,
I think you accept that.
absolutely.
And so compare your book to Ambrose. Tell us about Lewis and the volatility and also the weirdness about his strengths were also his weaknesses.
Sure. Well, first, let's be clear. Ambrose's book is an American classic. I have friends who still say, that's my favorite book of history ever written. So it's a
No, this was
wonderful book. It's a
great read,
compelling
great
book.
narrative. Yeah, he was a
Right.
great writer.
Yeah, for no doubt. But
Yeah, I
there'd be
donated because of him to what was the D-Day Museum in New Orleans, and then
that's
it
right.
became the World War II Museum. I went to see him speak at the New York Historical Society, and my uncle was in D-Day, and so he was forming the D-Day Museum after he wrote that book.
Yeah, no.
Sorry for that segue. Just wanna let you know how I mean, this was an important guy to me. I read most of his books, including Eisenhower.
No,
But
he's an important guy to so many readers and lovers of American history, and you know, we don't need to take that away. That is all absolutely true. But there's two things I would say about my book compared to his book. The first is that there's just a little bit of a different focus. I feel like when Ambrose wrote, it was very much kind of a man versus nature story. So yes, he would talk about the mountains and the rapids, and that stuff's in my book too. But to me, what makes the expedition so fascinating are the human beings. I always think human beings are the most interesting thing of all. And so I think my story is not man versus nature so much as it's man versus man. So the captains versus their soldiers, the Americans versus the natives, trying to sort of get that human complexity you're talking about. And I would also just say that, and this is not Ambrose's fault, but he didn't have the scholarship that I had. So when I say people tell half the story, you know, the native people show up in his book, and he, to his credit, writing back in the 1990s, is honest about, you know, Americans took their land. He doesn't pretend that that didn't happen, but he's not able to get inside the native point of view. He's not able to make the native people seem like their own characters. They're just sort of supporting characters who show up and go away. I was able to draw on decades of scholarship and the new documents I found and interviews I did with native people to kind of make this a story with two sides. And I just think that's a better story. You know, when I think of my favorite stories, it's always where both sides of the equation are really interesting and nuanced. That's what I tried to do in this book. So, Undaunted Courage, if that's how you came to love Lewis and Clark, that's great. But I still think you're going to find a lot new in my book, and I think you
no,
can
listen,
they
this
complement.
you mentioned the Game of Thrones. I mean, this book reads like a nonfiction book. The characters are rich, the story is there, the earth is untended, you know, and there's a brilliant story here about the wealth transfer from the Native Americans, frankly, that were living in this area. There's a little bit of a morality thing here as well, but there's a wealth transfer going on between the European settlers and the Native Americans that's also in the book. So when you talk about Game of Thrones, everything is in here, Craig. This is why we wanted to get you on to talk about all this stuff. And speaking of Native Americans, you draw on some of the oral histories, the
Mhm.
indigenous oral histories alongside of the traditional archives. Why was that so important to you, and how does it change in your mind, what we consider to be the historical truth here about the exploration?
Sure. I think I'll just kind of give you a case study because these issues are really complicated, but my sort of operating idea is that oral history, written history, people want to pit them together, but they work best in conversation. So let me give you an example that also happens to be the coolest thing I found during my research, probably the coolest thing I'll ever find in my career. I found this interview with a guy named Wolf Calf, who is a Blackfoot man. And we know it's a really good source. It was written by a historian who was meeting with him in the 1890s when Wolf Calf was very old. And you can tell from the way the historian was writing that he just like was trying to write this down in real time. And so Wolf Calf, as a young man, way back in 1806, met with Lewis, and the Blackfoot and the Americans ended up having a battle. That was the word that Wolf Calf used. And this is something that is one of the probably two most famous encounters with Native people that Lewis and Clark had. It certainly shows up in Ambrose's book. But all historians have sort of taken the American point of view on this and said the Blackfoot were trying to steal our guns. And you know, let's be honest. If somebody's trying to take your guns, you're very within your rights to fight back, to try to get your guns, to try to protect yourselves, and that's what the Americans were doing. But Wolfcalf's interview says something different. Wolfcalf's perspective is different. He says we were trying to take their horses, not their guns. And that honestly lines up with all the best scholarship on the Blackfoot people, stuff done by the Smithsonian and other institutions. But here's the key thing, and this is what I mean about them working best in conversation. Once I read Wolfcalf's interview, I went back to Lewis's journal and I noticed something that nobody had seen before, that honestly I hadn't seen before, which is that the first half of Lewis's account of this battle, Lewis wasn't awake. He was relying on the testimony of an American soldier, and this American soldier fell asleep on the job, literally. He was supposed to be on watch, he fell asleep. So he was the person who killed one of the native people, and what you really come down to is not Lewis's words versus Wolfcalf's words, but this soldier's words versus Wolfcalf's words, and this soldier has a very vested interest in making the Blackfoot seem dangerous because otherwise Lewis is going to court-martial him or get him in trouble. You know, falling asleep on watch is a capital crime in this time period. So having these oral sources, having these written sources, bringing them together, they can kind of illuminate each other. But I never would have gone down this journey and sort of reinterpreted this moment if I hadn't had Wolfcap's perspective first. So that's why it's important for me to bring it all together and then still do the historian's work, which is to evaluate all your sources. What can we tell for sure? What is sort of more in the maybe category? A historian has to be rigorous for all sources, but a historian should also look at all sources.
Listen, I mean, you capture it better than I can, and I'm grateful to you. And also, you wrote another book about the presidents and their writing of books. And I guess I didn't get a chance to read that book, but it made me think about your own writing as you're reflecting about your own writing. I believe the title of it was Author in Chief.
That's right.
How did the process teach you about how historical myths get manufactured?
Well, it's interesting with presidents. That book sort of looked at the books presidents wrote, and I spent a lot of times in archives for that one too. And so many of the books written by presidents are our best source to understand presidents as young people. Like I still think about Harry Truman's memoirs all the time, and how when he would talk about his childhood, his love of history in high school, how much he loved reading about the lives of great people in the past. You know, that's historian David McCullough's book on Truman still use that material today. So presidents are so good about talking about their personal relationship, their patriotism, all that stuff. But then, of course, the closer you get to real power, that's when you start to get the president's side of the story and not everybody's side of the story. If you read Harry Truman's account of why he dropped the atomic bomb, you're going to be left wanting more information because Truman just isn't able to be as honest as you might want. So that was my main takeaway from that books by presidents can have real value and that they've been really important throughout American history. But also, you know, when presidents talk about big decisions, you're sometimes getting their spin, but then sometimes spin is interesting, right? Like if you can see why Harry Truman takes this perspective, you understand something about him, even if that perspective can't be treated as, infallible.
Down to the 5 words. Ready?
Let's do it.
Okay. So here are the 5 words. I'm going to give you the word. You're going to give me a sentence or two about that word. And my producer and I plucked these from your book.
Okay.
Okay. So when I say the word history, you say what?
Complicated and human stories that still feel relevant today.
Okay. I'm going to mispronounce her name, and I see her on my U.S. dollar coins now. So is it Sagawea?
It's actually pronounced a lot of different ways. I say Sacagawea, but there are lots of valid ways to say it.
Sacagawea. So who was she?
She was somebody who was a slave. And I think we see her on the dollar coin and we think of her as a friendly tour guide, and she was that. But she had a really hard life. And one of the new things I do in this book is sort of describe how she was abused, sexual violence, she was impregnated. But that just makes her more inspiring. She had these really tough years, and then she realized, if I can be that friendly guide, the captains will protect me, I can protect them, and I can make it hundreds of miles back to my people. She pulled it off. She was an explorer too, and she's an amazing human. Sorry, that's more than one sentence, but
Yeah,
you
no,
get me talking about Sacagawea,
I
I'm
wanted,
gonna
I
go all
wanted,
day.
I wanted, I wanted to bring her up because I
Sure.
think she's a big part of this.
Yeah, she's amazing.
She was left out in the beginning, and you fleshed her out for me.
Thank you.
Thomas Jefferson.
Complicated, an inspiring figure. Um, Somebody who, like most politicians, we don't necessarily want to pay attention to what he says. We want to pay attention to what he does. And the Lewis and Clark expedition is a great example of his values because it's what he tried to do.
I mean, these are complex people. I mean, I don't want to cancel these people. I mean, I just find that this is stupidity. That was the time that they lived in. We're gonna get Craig. You drive around in a car, okay? You're spewing fossil fuel.
That's true.
Someday there's going to be clean energy. 300 years from now, they're going to put a shroud over your statue. Okay, they're going to be like, "Who were these guys?" Okay, what the hell were they doing, ruining the earth like that? Right? I
I
mean,
I
so
I
we're
tot
you know,
I totally agree. My view is it's not a historian's job to say these are the heroes, these are the bad guys. My job is to put you in the canoe, show you
yeah.
what Jefferson cared about, show you what Lewis cared
You
about, then
and
you
you
make up
did
your mind.
that. You did that brilliantly.
Thank
So
you.
much so, I'm looking forward to your next work. Okay, let's go to my last 2 words. Are you ready? Empire. I say the word empire. You say what?
I say that there were lots of empires in 1804. America had an empire, France had an empire, Spain had an empire, but the Lakota had an empire too. These native nations were the real sources of power on the Missouri River, and that's why this story is a complicated Game of Thrones one, because you have lots of huge, powerful nations with really smart people in charge. Black Buffalo versus Jefferson. They're all coming together. They all want land. They want the same things. how's it going to go? That kind of mystery is at the core of my book.
Okay, I'm going to say the last two words and then give you the last word. Lewis and Clark.
Two people I love. I mean, just amazing Americans who gave everything they had. They sacrificed so much for their country and for what they believed in. Um, they weren't perfect people. They were different people. Let's go there. One thing that I think is important when you write this kind of book is you don't want to talk too much about, this is what everybody in the time period believed, because back then, just like today, people believed different things. So Lewis was much less interested in slavery than Clark was. Even these two best friends, these two heroes working together, they had different views on slavery. So the right thing to do is try to understand how each person saw the world in their own terms, in their own time. But yeah, Lewis and Clark, two incredibly courageous and fascinating human beings who loved their country and gave it everything they had.
Listen, you wrote an amazing book. The title of the book is The Vast Enterprise, A New History of Lewis and Clark. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. What are you going to do next, Greg? You got something in the works yet or not yet?
I think I'd like to write a book about one person. This one, the cast is so big, it's vast in Clark's words. So maybe I can find a book about one person and sort of get deeper into one person's head. But in this one, at least, I love the ensemble. I love
I would
bringing all
just
these
say
voices together.
don't pick a schizophrenic. We have some schizophrenics in Washington. Pick a person that's be a little easy to read, I would
I
say.
wouldn't want to write about somebody if I didn't like them. So yeah, it's going to be somebody I could get along with.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you being on, sir. Thank you.
My pleasure. Have a good one.
It's rooted in a belief that mankind is at its happiest in leisure and recreation, and that work is a necessary evil. It's a romanticized Marxian, Rousseauian vision of society. It is untrue that mankind is happiest when they're not working. Mankind deserves to have leisure and rest and recreation, family and memories and vacations, but mankind is fundamentally happiest when they're earning success, when they're being productive, when they're serving others. So the philosophy that is undergirding a 32-hour work week is offensively wrong.
Joining us now on Open Book, David Bahnsen. He's the founder and managing partner and chief investment officer of the Bahnsen Group, but he's also a best-selling author. This is one of many books that he has written and one of many books that I have read. The title of the book is Full Time: Work and the Meaning of Life. I think you're the William F. Buckley of our time. I actually think it's interesting. You're making headway. You're breaking through the block of ice. There's a lot of grossness to our political rhetoric, but you're a clear thinker and you're a clear writer. And I'm a fan of all of your books. But why did you decide to write this one related to the relationship with work, which is something Emerson and Thoreau, they've all tried to tackle?
I think, Anthony, that there is a societal moment we're living in that is theoretically a breaking point. There's a make or break opportunity here in that of all the things I could say negative about where I think society is, the political tribalization that drives me crazy, the polarization we have culturally, the red state, blue state conflicts, all these things that are I think, really unfortunate in American life because for all of our diversity and differences, it's very odd to me that people now hate each other over these differences. It used to be that someone who liked Midtown Manhattan like you and I do, and someone who liked the mountains in Montana like someone else, they disagreed with each other, but they didn't hate each other. And now they hate each other. And so I look at all these differences and things going on. And one of the things that to me can hold the American experiment together is the entrepreneurial DNA, the shared affinity for risk taking, the appreciation for labor and the fruits of labor that has been a vital part of the American experiment for 250 years. And I see that unraveling. I see a lower regard for work, a lower appreciation for successful work unfolding before our very eyes. And I see it from people on the right and the left, and I see it from people of faith and people that fancy themselves secular. And so to me, this issue would accelerate our path to being a more European-like state quicker than anything else in the political arena. And I felt compelled to write about it.
Okay. I have a theory. After reading this book, first of all, I love the title, and I want you to get into how you titled it. But I have a theory I want to test on you. I was born in 1964. I'm the last of the baby boomers demographically. That era was 46 to 64. If you so I graduated in 1982 from high school. If you were born the year I graduated, you are now 42 years old, and so definitionally you are in your mid age. You are now an adult, and I have a feeling that this generation was very coddled. I'm not saying that we weren't coddled, but they were very coddled. And I have a feeling that the self esteem movement, the ninth place trophies for soccer, all of these things have led people to become excessively righteous in their point of view. At the very same time, you had this proliferation of social media and this algorithmic technology that reinforces our views or our likes or our tastes. We dial into the same TV programs that reinforce our views, the podcasts, radios, whatever it may be. And we're not even living in the same world anymore, David. And so I find you're one of the more agreeable people, and I can have an intellectual conversation with you, a intellectual discourse. We can agree or disagree on something, and we both come out of the situation better informed. But I find that that's no longer the case. You go to places like universities or other places, you talk to these people. They have a totally different fact set that they're living off of than your fact set. And you're crossing like this. And then the hatred breeds in like you're a dummy.
Yeah.
How could you possibly feel this way? Okay. So what did I get wrong? What am I missing?
Well, I think that your assessment of the lay of the land is exactly accurate. And I wonder the coddling, how much that is at play in terms of the low view of work. One of the things I propose in the book is that the boomers, and I recognize you're right there at that kind of line between where the boomers ended and the Generation X that I'm a part of started. But there really wasn't a more productive generation in human history than the boomers. The production of goods and services and the basic output measured economically from the boomers was the most productive that the world has ever seen. Yet there's this other component that was very different. And I mean different in the sense that we had never once had a generation that entered the workforce with an eye on retirement, with a vision towards working so that you can then check out for the last 20, 25 years of your life. And I believe that all at once, the boomers gave us a positive legacy of working and output and aspiration and wealth building, and a negative of sort of portraying the idea that you're doing it so you can stop doing it. And you know that I'm an exception, and I sure as heck know you're an exception. I don't think you guys like you and me are wired to be able to stop. But I look around the society and see there's about 10,000 boomers a day retiring. And the notion of people that have been reasonably successful, and I don't mean hyper wealthy, but they've made it, they've done it, they have a nest egg, and they've been productive for 30 plus years in a given field. And now they're going to go to villages in Florida and drink and golf all day long. I find it absolutely depressing. But see, what to your point on the younger generations, in addition to them being coddled, they also saw their parents talk about work as if it was something you did to not have to do it anymore, counting the days to turning 60 or 65 or whenever the golden watch was coming and all that kind of stuff. And I just think the millennials beat them to it. They just said, well, you want to talk about work as this thing to stop doing when you're 60. I'm going to start talking about a thing I don't want to do when I'm 30. And you combine that with the coddling that told them everything was okay. I think it is made for a very different mentality in the way that each generation approaches work.
Okay. I mean, very well said. You articulate this very well in your book. Why call it full time, which is a title I love?
Yeah, so there's two reasons. First and foremost, I love the shorthand kind of summary of the fact that I do not view my job. I've been in a position for some time where I could work less and still make the money I make, but I would be less productive. That full time is not about the hours, the pay, the status. It's about the mentality of productivity, and that I want to be full time committed to being my best self, my most productive, innovative, creative self I can be. The secondary reason is a bit more niche within the faith community. As you know, I'm a Christian, uh, take my faith and my faith distinctives very seriously. And there's a book that's very, very, very popular. It sold 1 million copies. You know how hard it is to sell 1 million copies of a book organically, called Halftime, Moving from Success to Significance. And it's just one of these midlife crisis books encouraging people that, okay, well, you've been successful, you've had your careers and all that stuff, but now it's time to focus on being significant. And I hate that mentality. And I find it reasonably offensive that one would suggest that people in their success, in the things they do that build not only commercial success, but personal, professional, achievement, that those things aren't significant, that they're not significant to God, that they're not significant to society, that they're not significant to the service of others they represent. I think it implicitly captures a terrible view of economics and a terrible view of culture. And so I wanted to sort of transcend that halftime mentality and title my book Full Time.
It works. It works for me. And you are a full-time worker, so am I. And I think you get joy out of your work. I don't think my work makes me feel like I'm working. Even my darkest moments at work, and I've had several, I feel like it's part of a process and it's part of a journey. And you have to take the good with the bad. There's a guy that we're both close to. I know him very well. His name is David Rubenstein. He's the former founder and one of the managing partners at Carlisle. 74 years old now. I went to visit him once on the island of Nantucket. He has this spectacular house on the bluff overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. It was a beautiful summer day. I got to the front door. There was a placard on the front door, David. It said, "Rather be working." And so here was this man who had built this beautiful house on the bluff to, quote unquote, retire in. And at age 70 plus, he's now taking control of the Baltimore Orioles. What is it, David? What is in the DNA of a David Bonson or a David Rubenstein that wires them like that so that their full-time experience, which is mostly a work-related experience, is something they want to continue to do?
Well, it's interesting. I would love to say, as a man of faith, that perhaps it's something theological and spiritual, whether one is Jewish or Catholic or Protestant or what have you. But I don't. I think that in my case, I have strong beliefs in my kind of transcendent belief system that drive me. But there is a sense in which we all know too many people that have this that also have faith distinctives and don't feel driven that way. And I know so many people that seem to not be connected to a sort of transcendent faith system that do have it. And that story with Rubenstein, I've told you before that it was at your conference where I heard and met Ken Langone. And this guy blew me away. It's a very Rubenstein-like story. Obviously, multi-billion-dollar net worth, man of incredible achievement, both in the private sector and in philanthropy. And he's just wearing a suit and tie every day, going off having a lunch. And he just said, I get up and do it because I know what happens if I don't. And he feels wired to just continue going and driving. And that was an early salt when that conversation happened.
Yeah,
It really impacted me.
Yeah, David, it was 10 years ago. It was 2014. Kenny, who's been a mentor of mine forever, he's had many great lines. But one of the best Ken Langone lines is that helping others is the key to your success, and it's the key to your happiness. And of course, he went on to use the money that he's made in his career to fully fund the Langone Hospital, so the NYU Langone, but he's also now set up an endowment where if you go to NYU medical school, you don't pay tuition. Ken Langone pays your tuition.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. You get into that school, you go tuition free. And so it's one of the most sought after medical schools in the world now because of that. And but that's you, David. I mean, I want to pay you a huge compliment here. You are a thinker, and you're looking to the younger generation. The younger generation has a vastly different view, as you point out in this book, about work. So, are they lacking purpose? Are they lonely? Are they going to leave the labor force? My dad left the labor force at age 65 on June 9th, his birthday, but he was in a union. And by the way, he worked outside his whole life. He really couldn't work much longer on that job, at least. You and I may be able to go like Warren Buffett into our 90s, but we're indoors, we're out at direct sunlight, and there's no heavy lifting.
Yeah.
A man that's working outside, I get why you go into retirement literally on your birthday, but tell us about this younger generation. Where are we going and why?
So on one hand, and I don't know if your experience with Gen Z employees has been the same as mine, there is a sense in which I feel a little encouragement or a little hope, because the Gen Zers that I've hired and worked with and what I've observed culturally, both my wife and I have become big students of generational theory. They do want mentorship. They do ask questions for their own self-improvement, where my experience with millennials was largely they had a lot to tell me about what I could do better, where Gen Z had a lot to ask about what they could do better. And I think that's a very important distinction between the two. But there is a huge sense in which I think we have a big need. And a lot of this, Anthony, my advocacy of free enterprise, we have a lot of education to do with Gen Z, because when they say they want mission and purpose, there's a sense in which they say, I love what this company is doing, but it just doesn't have a mission for me. And they need to have something stapled on to a company with some sort of social justice mission or something that strikes them as more virtuous. And I think the reason for that is that they were not taught that the production of goods and services that meet the needs of humanity is a social cause, that it is driving more well-being for others. And very candidly, it's often doing more than even some of these so-called philanthropic or nonprofit groups. I use the example of Elon Musk. He used to be kind of a darling of the left. He's now become a darling of the right. But regardless, just put all the politics and stuff aside, what are the three things that he's done, which, by the way, are in multi-billion dollar enterprises and aspirations? I mean, after taking all the money from PayPal and having that kind of score, he said, well, I want to go save the planet environmentally and start electric vehicle company with Tesla. And then out of the massive amount of wealth created there, he parlays it into, I want to have human beings occupy Mars with SpaceX. And then he says, I think free speech is under attack. I want to go buy Twitter. So you're talking about three enterprises with either tens of billions and in some cases hundreds of billions of enterprise value. And in all three cases, there was some cause around it connected to the company that was massive. Anything that guy does in the nonprofit world is destroying value. He should be doing nothing but for-profit wealth creation activities, for the simple reason that he's good at it and he's not good at the other. And with Ken Langone, who's been a wildly charitable person, and you see his name on the hospitals, and the incredible impact he's had. At SALT, he was telling us about what he did to raise the money to save St. Patrick's Cathedral and getting Jews and Protestants and Muslims and Catholics to all give to this cause. But you know what else he did? He started Home Frickin' Depot. The amount of jobs created out of that, the amount of wealth created out of that. So I want Gen Z to realize that there's a cause in enterprise, that there is the meeting of needs of humanity, because we cannot have our needs met if we're not meeting the needs of others. And I don't think we have to virtue signal on top of it for the work to be meaningful.
I mean, it's so well said. And there's something else that the baby boomers did, though. They are very productive. There's no question. And there's a ton of them. And again, myself included. But I'm going to indict the baby boomers for a moment because I feel as a political class, the ones that went into politics and the culture that they created has been very destructive to us. It started out okay. Bill Clinton, right, like him or dislike him and Newt Gingrich, two baby boomers, they fought it out, but they balanced the budget, but we got into the wars and we got into the global financial crisis and we have spiraled debt. We went from George Washington to George Walker Bush, $7 trillion, David. Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden, 28 trillion now and counting. So what do you say to that? Productive people, but as a political class, didn't the baby boomers overpromise, undertax, and are setting up this new generation that you're describing, with a generational forward transfer of wealth? In addition to the money that's going to go to them in their inheritance, they are inheriting a 30 to 40 trillion dollars worth of debt on the federal government's balance sheet.
Yeah, there's absolutely no question that the legacy of the boomers at a macro level, not targeting any particular people or whatnot, but macro, the legacy of the boomers is one of the most self-centered generations in history. If I can go back to my little faith point I made a moment ago, as a pretty consistent Bible thumper here, I'd also add the sexual revolution has not really seemed to create happier people, just from my observation. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot that's come out of the legacy of that generation that has weighed on the soul of society. Mm-hmm. Economically, you're exactly right. And in addition to the spending and leaving the debt callously, they've also left a mentality that tells the next generation they can kick the can, and the next generation after them, they can kick the can. And so what generation ends up having the courage, like the greatest generation that preceded the boomers, who stood up to totalitarianism and fascism, what the generation will be that is willing to be fiscally honest for the sake of economic stability for their children and grandchildren, I don't know who it'll be. But it wasn't the boomers, and it's clearly not going to be Gen X or Gen Y either.
But this is my secondary question. That setup, has that affected this generation's view of work? Because like, oh my God, I'm walking into this trap here. Why don't I dial myself back and not care as much?
Yeah, I have my answer is no, but I'm sympathetic to where it comes from. But the problem I have with it is the contrary indicators, the counterfactuals. I look at those things, and forget me because I don't want to toot my own horn, but there's so many people that have a mentality of, hey, forget the excessive government debt. Let's go to the two most obvious examples for Gen Z: student debt and ridiculous housing prices. You can look at it and say, this just isn't fair. I got a good job. I went to school. I've studied. And now the student debt is high and the housing prices are high. I can't get ahead. What do you do at that point? I think there's a mentality in the top 20% of people that says, I'm going to go overcome it. I'm going to go figure it out. I'm going to perform and achieve necessary to meet that moment, as unfair as it may be, as challenging and distressing as it may be. I'm going to deal with life on life's terms. And then I think there is a significant portion that have used it as a way to surrender. And then there's a middle ground that I think is the question for society. The old J.D. Vance, the one I liked, he wrote a book called Hillbilly Elegy. It's one of the greatest books I've read in a long time. I absolutely loved it. Everybody loved it. So I'm not being contrarian here. It was a very popular book. But he talks about that kind of disgruntled person in a white working class town. And in this case, it was in Ohio, but he had come from Appalachian Valley, whatever. And someone just saying, I can't get ahead and screw this, screw that. And he'd get a job, he'd get an opportunity, and he would just sleep in and he wouldn't show up and he'd fail a drug test. And then he'd get fired and he would say, man, can you believe this ridiculous Obama economy? And J.D. Vance said, I'm not saying the Obama economy was great for everyone, but I will say this. It had nothing to do with this guy, right? He was a byproduct of his own decisions. And
Yeah.
that's
No,
what it's going to take. I wish housing prices were not so high. And I think it's inexcusable that we continue to constrain supply in such a way that we can't clear supply and demand in a more price efficient way. However, those things that we have in life that are unfair, you get to pick how you're going to respond. And I recommend people respond how the top 20% are responding, which is meeting the moment and overcoming the challenge.
very well said. I want to switch to another topic. I could talk to you for several hours, but we limit ourselves here so we can get. I find a 30-minute podcast. I mean, Joe Rogan's a lot better than me as a podcaster, but 3 hours is long, man. I feel like the 30-minute podcasts are the ones that get digested. Let's go to the book of Genesis, and let's go to your thoughts about these allegories, these stories, God's book, the good book, and talk a little bit about the impact that it's had on you, and talk about the guidance that's in the lessons of these old stories memorialized in the Old and New Testament.
Well, it's my belief that people have to ask themselves the great questions in life: Who are we? Where did we come from? Why are we here? What do we need to do? And I believe very seriously that for those of us who do believe we were made by God, that there's a purpose. And when I read Genesis and try to get an idea of what that purpose is, I recognize a lot of people don't believe the same theological or philosophical things I do. But I wrote this book, and I didn't write it to capture what other people believe. I wrote it to capture what I believe. And what I believe is that God made mankind with an elevated dignity, that we have a soul that can never die, that we have an eternal destiny, that God cares about us and made us with a reason, with rational faculties, with self-preservation, with an interiority, the ability to be contemplative, to see beauty, to appreciate beauty, to create beauty. He didn't give that to the platypus or the dinosaurs or fish. And for that matter, he didn't even give it to the sun, moon, and stars. So he made a beautiful world, but he uniquely made us as the caretakers of the world, from which we decided to go invent the wheel and start a fire and build the pyramids and create civilization. So this great journey we're all living in my belief, comes out of God creating the world because we are made in his image and likeness, and he did so because we reflect his capacity as a creator, a producer, an innovator. Anthony, the most elitist thing I've ever heard is that there are 50% of us who are capable of working and producing and 50% who are not. I don't believe
that's
it.
absurd. No, it's
I
absurd.
believe all of us are
I think
capable of being
you
productive.
also make the point that the good work, the good book, that there's purpose in work, and that we have to provide dignity. And frankly, a good society provides dignity to work and access to work and makes people feel aspirational. Let's go to the 4-day work week for a second. Give me your thoughts there. You're right about it.
I'm clearly a big opponent of it, but I want to be an opponent even beyond the absurdity of the policy. What the unintended consequences economically and politically would be are really unfathomable. How much damage it would do to the people that people like Senator Sanders say they want to help. And by the way, I believe him. I do think his motive is being pro-worker, but I think he is naive and wrong. But even if we just ignored the policy differences, ignored the unintended consequences, first of all, the maximum hours can't be set. You can only use the state to implement what an employer will allow, what the employee is allowed to work for an employer. The employer can still work however much they want. So these people say they're so worried about wealth inequality. Good luck with that. Because if you think that Bezos and Musk are going to stop at 32 hours, or any startup entrepreneur for that matter, I got a bridge to sell you. And the idea, it's effectively a backdoor 20% pay increase because they're not allowed to lower wages. So you're paying the same wages for 20% less work. It's a war on output at a higher per unit cost. So it is deteriorating of every element of price discovery, of productivity. It's a terrible idea economically. And I'm saying throw all of that out and pretend I didn't say it. It's rooted in a belief that mankind is at its happiest in leisure and recreation, and that work is a necessary evil. It's a romanticized Marxian, Rousseauian vision of society. It is untrue that mankind is happiest when they're not working. Mankind deserves to have leisure and rest and recreation, family and memories and vacations. But mankind is fundamentally happiest when they're earning success, when they're being productive, when they're serving others. So the philosophy that is undergirding a 32-hour work week is offensively wrong.
All right. Very well said. Last question, then we're going to go to 5 famous words, which is the ending of all my podcasts. You dedicate the book to your dad, Dr. Gregory Lyle Bonson. Tell us why.
Well, my dad was my dad, but he was my best friend, my hero. And I got 21 years with him, and he died at age 47 of a heart condition. And I not only hold him up in such tremendous regard for the brilliant intellectual and thinker that he truly was, but as I say in the dedication, in addition to really, I think, teaching me how to think and live, he taught me how to work. And his work ethic was unparalleled. I don't think a lot of academics and intellectuals and scholars today work how he did. I woke up pretty early every day, and there he was already working, sitting in his study. And that model he set for me stayed with me. And then, as God would have it, it turned out that my work ethic was applied to a business that happened to pay a hell of a lot more than being a pastor. So even though I went to a different vocational field than my dad did, as you did, Anthony, my dad's work ethic is what I brought into my field, and for that, I'm eternally grateful.
Yeah, we share that. I can remember my dad. The lunch pail went into the refrigerator at 10 p.m. and he took that lunch pail out of the refrigerator at 3:30 a.m. on the job at 4:30.
Yeah.
And so it's something he did, and I always think of that. And he did say to me, David, which I think you'll appreciate, when I got my job at Goldman Sachs, he said to me, never complain about that job. I said, why is that, Dad? He says, you're indoors, you're out of direct sunlight, and there's no heavy lifting. And I often think about that in the trials and tribulations that I've been through in my career. Okay, I'm down to my 5 words. How this works is I say the word, you think of something, and you respond to me. It could be a word, a sentence, just something that comes up. I say the word ambition. You say what?
Drive.
I say the word purpose.
Calling.
Okay. This is tied to purpose, I think, in some ways. But I say the word faith.
You say the word faith?
Faith.
Oh, yeah. Meaning. There's meaning in our faith.
Life.
That's a good one. I think it's all the above. It's faith and purpose and calling.
Well, I mean,
you're right.
You're right about it. But the thing, Bonson, that you write in this book is it's to be loved. It's to be enjoyed. Life is to be enjoyed. It's trials and tribulations. The darkness allows us to appreciate the light. And I do believe that we're here to take it in some ways. And I think you're right about that. And I think that's what blends in the purpose and faith and so forth, and meaning and ambition.
And I think you said it earlier, talking about the ups and downs in your career, that you view it all as a journey. And in a lot of ways, that's a great word to respond to life with, is this journey.
Yes.
Because I think we can't help but sometimes, especially as younger people, to have this view of life that we're headed to some mountaintop and we're just trying to get to this spot, and then we're just going to kind of sit in our porch and sort of rub our beards in appreciation of all the things we've done. And I don't think people realize how elusive that is and how evasive it can be. That the journey is all the joy. And that journey for you, for me, for many people that know what I'm talking about, the journey is really inclusive of some very difficult moments. and being able to overcome and work through those difficult moments, that's life.
No
And
question.
yeah.
And I would say that one of the things we have to be careful of is by continuing to have faith. I think it provides us some solace, because I'm noticing as we secularize our societies, people despair and they start to fear death. But if you go to Google, there's been roughly, according to Google, 100 billion people that have lived. There's 7 or 8 or 9 billion of them living now, but there's been roughly 100 or so that have lived. God's batted 1,000, David. Or in the immortal words of Mel Brooks, relax. None of us are getting out of here alive. Okay, so the last word, and I'm going to give you the last word, is work. The word work.
I think of, just as the book title says, I think of work as the meaning of our lives. That work is that a venue for us to, as individuals made with special purpose, dignity. Work is not only the verb of economics, but it is the actions we take that give our lives meaning.
Well, you're very kind to join us today. The title of your book, which I absolutely love, Full Time Work and the Meaning of Life by David Bahnsen. Thank you for joining us on Open Book today.
Thanks so much for having me, my friend.
My next guest, I had a guy called David Bahnsen on the podcast, and he was talking about the meaning of work. Okay, he basically thinks that work is an integral part of your life. You spend lots of time at work, maybe sometimes more time with your coworkers than you do with your family. So you got to pick a job that you really love. Do you believe that, Ma?
Yes, I believe that you love your job.
Okay, I do love my job because I don't even know what I do for a living. That's the funny part about my job. But let me ask you this: did you like your job, Ma? You were a makeup artist.
Yes, I loved it.
Tell me, why
And
did you like being a makeup artist, Ma?
Because people, there were all walks of life that used to come into that shop, including clear role models. And people that were depressed, and if you did their makeup and it came out right, which I usually was very good at it, believe it or not, on a conceited note, they would get a lift, and then they would come back happy.
Okay, so makeup and aesthetics, if people take care of themselves and they take care of their hair and their makeup and their looks, they feel better about themselves, right?
They feel better, yes.
Yeah, even when people lose weight, they get more confident and happier. They get more active. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but people do get in slumps. It's human nature. You know, none of us are perfect, so they do get in a slump. And even the people that can't afford to look better would come into Bernice's shop for sure.
Okay.
And Bernice was savvy, and she would let them come in, and I would do their makeup, and they would feel good.
Okay. Let me ask you this question, Mom. If I didn't like my job, do you think it would alter my personality?
I don't think you would take a job unless you liked it.
Okay.
I think you have a strong personality, and if you didn't like your job, you wouldn't stay there. You would go forward to find the right thing that you like to do, which you did.
Right.